I am starting a new sermon series today called Resurrection Stories. And we're going to be talking not only about the resurrection of Jesus, but even more importantly about how it impacts others after the resurrection, those whose lives were transformed by the resurrection. Today we're going to read, this is probably my favorite resurrection story. It's from the Gospel of Luke. We read through Mark during Holy Week, but this is a story at the very end. You may remember at the very end of Mark, there's a reference to this story, but he doesn't really tell the story. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke all share a lot of material that is the same, but Luke is the only one that really tells this story in detail. And it's a long story, but it's a really good story, so I think it's worth reading the whole thing. Luke 24. Now this is the time frame here is, just think the mid-morning through the day of the original Easter Sunday. Now on that same day, two of the disciples were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. One of the advantages of reading from the screen is I get to bold verses that are important. So you look at this, you might say, this sermon might be about seeing things clearly, right? There's another one later. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" And they stood still, looking sad. And then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" And he asked them, "What things?" He's being a little coy at this point, we might say. They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the third day since these things took place. And more than that, some women in our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him." Then he, referring to the stranger or Jesus, then Jesus said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself and all the scriptures. As they came near the village of Emmaus to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening, and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. And when he was at the table with them, he took the bread and blessed and broke it and gave it to them. Here's another bolded verse. Did you notice? Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. And then he vanished from their sight. And they said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. For the last decade or so, I've been almost obsessed about something interesting with sports, and that is the role of eyesight in the performance of elite athletes. So I'll just give you an example or two of this. We just had the NFL draft, and quarterbacks are always high on the list, right, for most teams. You can have a good NFL team without having at least an exceptional, if not a great NFL quarterback, so everybody wants a good quarterback. And we saw the quarterbacks being drafted. We know that some of them are going to make it and some of them are not. And I think the difference, but there are some quarterbacks who have great athletic ability. They have great arms. They're extremely precise. But they don't necessarily, they maybe were great in college, but they don't make it in the NFL. It's because I think the difference between a good quarterback and a great quarterback in the NFL is that the great quarterback not only has great athletic ability, is tall, has a strong arm, is precise, but also has great eyes. Every great quarterback has great eyes. He can see the whole field. He knows where all 22 players are. He knows where the safeties are, and he pretty much can see the angles they're going to take on defense. He can find not only the primary receiver, but the secondary and the tertiary receiver. Eyesight is one of the great distinctions between the good and great quarterbacks. The same is true, you might be surprised at this, of a running back. There are lots of great running backs who are fast and agile. But the difference between a good and great running back is the great running back is not only fast and agile, but he can see the field in front of him. He can see the lanes and the holes and the opportunities to make more yardage. You think about your favorite running backs, that'll apply to every single one of them. Lots of them are fast and strong, but the great ones have great eyesight. So I'll give you, you may be getting tired of the sports metaphor, but I'm going to give you one more. Billie Jean King, the great tennis player, once said that at the height of her game, when she was playing at her very best, she could see a tennis ball coming at her at over 100 miles an hour, and her sight was so good she could literally see the seams as they rotated on the tennis ball. I used to play a little tennis. If you've ever played tennis, you can imagine what a great competitive advantage that would be. Am I not right? So it's really interesting, the role of sight in high-performance athletics. And I use this introduction because I think one of the missed themes in the New Testament, especially in the Gospels, is the importance that Jesus put on being able to see and to see clearly. I don't know that a book has ever been written about this. I'm thinking about this for my retirement job. If you were to go through the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and pick out all the texts that involve Jesus helping people to see and to see more clearly, I believe you would see that it's one of the great themes in the New Testament. I'll give you a couple of examples. We asked you to read through Mark during the season of Lent, and a lot of you did. If you'll turn back to the 8th chapter of Mark, right in the middle, there are 16 chapters in Mark. In the 8th chapter of Mark, there is this story where Jesus gets upset with the disciples because there are a bunch of people out there. They've come to see Jesus. They're tired and they're hungry, and the disciples get anxious about it. And Jesus gets upset with them because he's already done it once. He's taken the loaves and the fish and multiplied them and fed everybody. And he turns to the disciples, and out of exasperation, he says, "Do you not have eyes to see, and do you not have ears to hear? What do you not understand about my ability to bless people with abundance?" It was a kind of a spiritual short-sightedness along with physical myopia. And you see statements like that from Jesus a lot throughout the New Testament. And then right after that story is the story of Jesus healing a blind man. And this is maybe my favorite miracle in the New Testament because it didn't work completely the first time. It's right after there in the 8th chapter. He comes along and he finds this blind man who wants to be healed, and he takes him out kind of into the woods, out into the country by himself so nobody can see this. And he takes spit and mud, and he touches this man's eyes. And he says, "Now, can you see?" And this is interesting. The man said, "Well, yeah, I think I can see a little bit better." He said, I can see people, but they look like trees." I think this is funny. Jesus had to do it again. It was like it's like if you go to your surgeon to remove the cataracts, it didn't work the first time. Jesus touches him on the eyes a second time, and then he says, now I can see clearly. For Jesus, a rich spiritual life involves being able to see things clearly. And you see that all through. In Matthew, in the 6th chapter, Jesus says to the disciples, "Look at the lilies of the field and the birds in the air. Do you not see how God created each one of them loves and blesses them and cares for them. Do you not see that you too are a child of God, created by God? Be not anxious. Be not anxious. So when we come to this story, we bolded 2 verses for you. There are a lot of ways to think about this story. It's one of the richest resurrection stories we have in the New Testament. But one of the ways to think about this, it is a story about 2 disciples who didn't at first see clearly and later on were able to see clearly. Once again, it's a theme in the resurrection stories. Maybe I'll bet every one of you have read the back of the bulletin this morning. Kathy Sweeney, who has done such a great job for us over the last 6 years, we've been blessed by her ministry. And she starts off telling the story about her current chapter in her ministry by telling the story of Mary Magdalene, who was the one who had the most compelling experience, I think, with the risen Christ early that morning on Easter Sunday. But at first, she met him and she thought Jesus, the resurrected Christ, she thought he was the gardener. She did not recognize him. And then later, after he spoke to her, she could see him clearly. And so I wonder if this story about the 2 disciples on their way to Emmaus is a story that tells us about the fact that much of the time in life, for one reason or another, we do not see things clearly. And that's one of the things we want the most. Don't we long to be able to see life clearly? But in fact, as we move forward in our journey in life, there are times when we do not see things clearly. There are times when things are going well and we're just having one good thing happen after another. We're feeling blessed and happy all the time. I wrote a column about this a couple of weeks ago. There are times like that when Jesus almost fades in our lives. Life is so good that we don't see the presence of God very clearly in our lives. And then there are times when we suffer a great deal, when bad things happen, and you've seen people just get on one of these rolls where it's one bad thing after another. An illness, the breakup of a marriage, the death of a loved one. And in those times, it's so difficult to see and feel and experience the presence and love of God in our lives. And maybe as much as anything, just the kind of ordinariness of our lives, when we just find ourselves moving through life in kind of a daze or a malaise, and there's nothing particularly vital or exciting or joyful about life, it's easy to lose sight of God in our lives. So this is a story, I think, that tells us about the importance of great sacramental moments. Those moments when all of a sudden the scales fall from our eyes and we see things clearly. We see that not only is Jesus with us, but Jesus has been with us every step of the way. You've had those moments where life has been stressful or difficult, and you find yourself up early one morning and the sun rises, and all of a sudden the scales fall from your eyes, and you know about the power of a creator God who created you and created the ones you love and blesses you in the midst of all that has gone wrong. And you think, surely God has been with me every step of the way. And frankly, that's what the sacraments are for you and me today. We will bring you to the table, an open table. Everyone is invited. And the Greek word that we use for this, we call it the Lord's table or the Lord's meal. But the Greek word we use it's the Eucharist, which means thanksgiving. It's a time when we come and we break the bread with thanksgiving. And at its best, it is an important moment in our lives where we come and by breaking and receiving the bread, we give thanks to God. And we look back and we see, oh yes, He's been with us every step of the way. We see clearly the presence of Christ in our lives and that we've never been abandoned. And we say, oh yes, thanks be to God. Thanks be to God. Amen.